The bank was busy that afternoon, too busy. Customers shuffled in and out, some impatiently tapping their feet, others staring at their phones, lost in their own worlds. The line stretched toward the entrance, a mix of sighs and quiet complaints filling the air. Tellers moved mechanically behind the counter, their voices monotone, their smiles forced. At the front of the line stood an elderly black woman, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small purse. She leaned in toward the glass, struggling to read the fine print on the form in front of her. "I'm sorry, dear," she said softly. "My eyes aren't what they used to be. Can you help me fill this out?" The teller, a young woman with an irritated expression, barely glanced up. She sighed loudly. "Ma'am, you need to complete the form before I can do anything." A few customers in line turned to watch. The tension in the room shifted, from impatience to discomfort. Miss Johnson hesitated. "I just need a moment." The teller cut her off. "Maybe you should come back when you're better prepared." From across the room, someone else was watching. Vin Diesel leaned forward in his seat. His expression darkened. He had seen enough. Her name was Ms. Johnson, and for as long as she could remember, this had been her bank. She had been a loyal customer for years, coming in every month to deposit her pension checks, withdraw cash for groceries, and pay her bills. She had seen tellers come and go, but today she was met with a face that didn't recognize her. A teller who didn't know or care who she was. Ms. Johnson had always been independent. She had worked hard her whole life, raising 3 children, working 2 jobs, and never once asking for help. Even now, in her late 70s, she tried to do things on her own. But lately, her eyesight had gotten worse, and today, the fine print on the withdrawal slip was just too much. She had politely asked for help, assuming it wouldn't be a problem. But the moment the teller sighed and rolled her eyes, Ms. Johnson felt it. Humiliation. The kind that made her shrink inside. She cleared her throat, forcing a small smile. "I just need a little help, sweetheart. I've been coming here for years." The teller barely looked up. "And I'm telling you, ma'am, I can't process this unless the form is filled out correctly." Miss Johnson's hands trembled as she fumbled for a pen. The line behind her grew restless. She could hear the low murmurs, feel the impatient stares burning into her back. And then, from across the room, a presence, a shift in the air. Vin Diesel sat still, watching. His jaw tightened. This wasn't right, and he wasn't going to let it continue. Vin Diesel sat in the waiting area, his hands resting on his knees, his sharp eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. He had come here for a routine banking errand, nothing more. But now, any thought of his own business had vanished. His focus was on Ms. Johnson. She stood at the counter, her small frame looking even smaller under the weight of the moment. Her hands trembled as she struggled with the form, her face flushed with embarrassment. The teller sighed again, this time louder, as if making a show of her impatience. She tapped her nails against the desk, shifting her weight, glancing at the line growing behind Ms. Johnson. "Ma'am, I really need you to hurry. We have other customers waiting." Vin's jaw tightened. He had spent his career playing strong, fearless characters. But this was real life. And in real life, strength wasn't about throwing punches or driving fast cars. It was about standing up when it mattered most. Ms. Johnson lowered her head, fumbling through her purse, searching for her glasses. Her fingers shook as she tried to hold the pen steady. The humiliation was clear on her face. A few customers in line shook their heads, murmuring under their breath. Some were impatient, others uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward, except Vin Diesel. He sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes darkened. The bank teller didn't realize it yet, but she had just made a mistake. Vin had seen enough. This wasn't about a form anymore. This was about basic human decency. He stood up, and just like that, the entire room shifted. The customers behind Miss Johnson, once restless and impatient, suddenly fell silent. The teller, still oblivious, continued tapping her nails. not noticing the 6-foot-tall, broad-shouldered man making his way toward the counter. But she was about to. Because Vin Diesel wasn't just watching anymore, he was about to make his presence known. Miss Johnson's hands shook as she gripped the pen, her heart pounding in her chest. She just needed a moment, just a little patience. But patience was the last thing she was getting. The teller sighed loudly again, crossing her arms. "Ma'am, I don't have all day." The murmurs behind her grew louder. Someone in line muttered, "Come on. Some of us have places to be." Another customer shook their head, whispering, "She should have brought someone to help her." Miss Johnson's throat tightened. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't trying to make anyone's life harder. The teller leaned forward, her voice laced with irritation. "Maybe you should come back with someone who can help you." That was it. Miss Johnson felt the sting of humiliation hit her like a wave. She had never been spoken to like this before, not in all the years she had been a customer here. Her dignity felt stripped away in an instant. She opened her mouth to say something, to fight back, to defend herself. But before she could, a deep, steady voice cut through the room. "She doesn't need to come back. She needs respect." The teller froze. The entire bank went silent. Slowly, Miss Johnson turned, along with every customer in line. Vin Diesel stood tall behind her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The teller's face paled. She had just been caught, and not by just anyone. Vin took a slow step forward, his deep voice steady but commanding. "Is this how you treat your customers?" The air in the room changed. Customers, once impatient, now watched with wide eyes. The teller's mouth opened, but no words came out. Miss Johnson blinked, looking up at the man now standing beside her. She had seen him in movies, but right now he wasn't an action star. He was her protector. And at that moment, everything changed. The entire bank fell into stunned silence. Vin Diesel stood firm, his piercing gaze locked onto the teller. His presence was impossible to ignore. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't making a scene. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough to shift the energy in the room. Miss Johnson, still shaken, turned toward him. She couldn't believe what was happening. The teller swallowed hard, her confidence suddenly wavering. "Sir, I was just following policy." Vin tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Policy," he repeated. His voice was calm, but there was something in it. Something that made the teller visibly shrink. He took another step forward, placing himself directly between Miss Johnson and the counter. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were just being rude." A few customers gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh, this just got real." The teller's face turned red. She glanced around, as if looking for an escape, but there was none. Miss Johnson lowered her head, still gripping her purse. "It's all right, sweetheart. I don't want any trouble." Vin turned to her, his expression softening. "No, ma'am. You're not the one causing trouble." He turned back to the teller, his voice steady. "She's been a customer here for years. She asked for help, and instead of giving it, you embarrassed her." The teller's lips parted, but before she could say anything, a new voice cut in. "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem?" The bank manager had just arrived, pushing through the crowd of onlookers. He looked nervous, probably because he had just realized exactly who was standing in his bank. Vin crossed his arms. "The problem is your staff." The entire bank watched, hanging on to every word. This wasn't just an ordinary day at the bank anymore, and what happened next would change everything. The bank manager's face was a mask of panic. He had walked in expecting just another customer complaint, but now he was standing face to face with Vin Diesel. He quickly adjusted his tie, forcing a nervous smile. "Mr. Diesel, what an unexpected surprise." Vin didn't smile back. "I bet it is." The manager's eyes darted toward the teller, who was now fidgeting, her confidence completely gone. She looked like she wanted to disappear. "Is there an issue?" the manager asked, his voice overly polite. Vin exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Yeah, there's an issue. You've got employees who think it's okay to humiliate an elderly woman instead of helping her." The bank manager's face turned pale. Customers in line nodded in agreement, a few whispering amongst themselves. Ms. Johnson, still holding her purse tightly, looked between them. "It's all right," she said softly. "I don't want to cause a scene." Vin turned to her, his voice gentler. "You didn't cause anything, ma'am." He looked back at the manager, his expression hardening. She asked for help. Instead, she was made to feel like she didn't belong here. That's not okay. The manager cleared his throat. "I deeply apologize for any misunderstanding." He turned sharply toward the teller. "We take customer service very seriously." The teller, still speechless, nodded quickly. But Vin wasn't done. He wasn't here for a corporate-style apology. He wanted action. He raised an eyebrow at the manager. "So, what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air. Everyone was waiting. The manager swallowed, realizing that he had no choice but to make things right. And his next words would decide everything. The bank manager felt the weight of every eye in the room. Customers stared, employees waited. Even the teller, now visibly shaken, looked to him for a way out. But there was no escape, not this time. He cleared his throat, forcing another stiff smile. "Ms. Johnson, I want to sincerely apologize for the way you were treated today." Ms. Johnson blinked, caught off guard. She had been expecting to be dismissed, not defended. The manager turned toward the teller. "You will personally assist Ms. Johnson with whatever she needs, right now." The teller nodded quickly, her face red with shame. "Yes, of course." Vin crossed his arms, watching carefully. Words were easy. Actions mattered more. Ms. Johnson hesitated before stepping back up to the counter. This time the teller's tone was softer, her hands steady as she helped fill out the form. No sighs, no impatience, just quiet, focused assistance. The tension in the room slowly faded. When the transaction was complete, Ms. Johnson turned to Vin, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Vin shook his head. "No need to thank me, ma'am. Everyone deserves respect." The manager exhaled in relief, nodding. "We'll make sure something like this never happens again." Vin gave him a look, one that said he'd better mean it. And just like that, justice had been served. But there was still one more lesson to be learned. The room had settled, but the lesson wasn't over. Not yet. Vin Diesel turned to the customers still waiting in line. "You all saw what happened today." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of something bigger. Some looked down, uncomfortable. Others nodded slowly. They had watched, but none had spoken up. Vin exhaled. Respect isn't just about grand gestures or big speeches. It's about the small moments, how we treat people when no one's looking. The manager nodded quickly, eager to agree. "Absolutely, sir. We'll do better." Vin studied him for a moment, then turned back to Ms. Johnson. "Are you good now?" She smiled warmly, this time without hesitation. "I am, son. Thanks to you." Vin chuckled. "You shouldn't have needed me for that." Ms. Johnson gently patted his arm. "Maybe not, but I'm sure glad you were here." He smiled, tipping his head in respect. Then, with one last glance around the bank, he pulled his cap back on and walked toward the door. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and as he stepped outside into the sunlight, he knew one thing for certain. Today, he hadn't just made a difference. He had reminded people of something they should never forget. Respect is free, but its impact lasts forever.